If you would open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. Hopefully you were able to join us last week when John Burns was here and he shared from his heart the mission of Greater Europe Mission, Jim, and how our involvement and our prayer and our help and joining in that effort is needed. And we are excited to be able to continue in that ministry and that mission with him, as well as our partnerships with the IMB across the world. And so missions is incredibly important to Champion Forest and to the people of Champion Forest. And so it's always great to have those guys in and those representation with us and speaking on their behalf. And hopefully you're also able to join us on Sunday as we kicked off a new series in the book of Ephesians, one of my favorite books, and hopefully one of yours as well. And if it's not, hopefully in the next months or so, we'll be able to share that love with you and you'll gain some love for that book. But it's one of Paul's greatest books, and throughout it there are incredibly deep and incredibly detailed theology and doctrine. And one of those theologies and one of those doctrines that he lays out is the doctrine of grace. And grace is sometimes thought of to be a New Testament idea, something that only happened after Jesus lived and died. But many people also understand that grace is not just a New Testament idea, but it's an Old Testament idea. And even before the Old Testament and after the New Testament, grace is an eternal idea. Because God's idea for us to spend eternity with Him is not possible without grace. And so tonight I'm going to show you, and I'm going to, as we walk through the book of Exodus, the life of Moses, we're going to see that grace was not only a New Testament thing, but it's evident in the Old Testament. And so as we walk through this, and I'm going to draw some parallels, and many of you know about Moses, and you've seen what Moses has done or heard and read about what Moses has done, and he's a relatively accomplished person. He led the Israelites out of Egypt, and then he delivered God's law to the Israelite people. And so you would say that Moses was maybe a hero of the faith, or maybe he was a heroic person, but Moses was not always a hero. You see, before God got involved, before God showed Moses grace, Moses was much more like a zero. And many of us can identify with that because before God got involved in our lives, we were a zero. And God intervened in our life and showed us grace, and He took us from that zero status and He brought us to a hero status, much like He did in the life of Moses. And so as we walk through this story tonight narratively, I'm going to just unpack some different things of how God intervened and how God showed Moses grace in ways that we will never be able to understand or explain. All we have to do is know that God did it, and only through God's grace is it possible. Because through God's grace, it's going to bring God glory. So hopefully you have found Exodus chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 1 through 10 as we begin. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And this is a good place to stop to do a little bit of backstory or some context to understand why this woman is putting her baby in a river. Because most mothers don't put their babies in rivers unless there's a reason, right? That's the important thing to have there. So Moses is about to be born into a very peculiar time. It's a very oppressive time in the life of the Israelites in Egypt. They have a new king, a new ruler, and he has basically been threatened or felt threatened by the population of the Israelites. He has basically shared in chapter 1 that if the Israelites continue to grow and the Egyptians were to go to war with their enemies, there are so many Israelites that if they were to join the opponent, that the Egyptians will be wiped away. So the Pharaoh or the king of Egypt decides that he's got to do something about this population problem. So he sets out a decree that all firstborn or all Hebrew-born boys should be put to death, which seems like a very drastic thing, but if you know anything about the Egyptians, that's about par for the course. And so the decree goes out, and he actually puts the midwives in charge of making sure that this decree is acted upon, that it's followed through with. which seems like a very interesting task to be given to the one who is usually responsible for bringing life, and now you're asking that person to take life. And so, as we read in chapter 1, the midwives are unable to follow through with their decree or their commands. And mostly because they are God-fearing women. And they understand that this is not what God would want them to do. So they refrain from killing the Hebrew-born boys. And when Pharaoh asks them about it, they say, well, the Hebrew women are very strong and courageous, and they give birth before we can even get there. They're not like the Egyptian women who wait for us. So that's why we can't kill any of the boys, because the Hebrew women are just so strong. And so the Pharaoh is upset with this, but God, of course, blesses the midwives and their families, and they become plentiful, and the population continues to grow because the midwives did what they had to do, and God was still in control of the situation. And so as we walk into chapter 2, the midwives have kind of done their thing, and now Pharaoh has even put a bigger charge. He's put a little bit more behind it. And it's incredibly important that we kill all the firstborn, or the Hebrew boys. And so the chapter 2 opens, and we see that Moses, we don't know it's Moses yet, is being birthed into the family, and she hides him for 3 months. And then she makes this basket, puts him in the river. So we'll pick up in verse 4. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman. She took it, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister, it's Moses' sister, said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of water." So we see this scene unfold, this narrative unfold, that Moses finds himself born into an interesting time, an unsettling time, and God is working through it, and God is intervening in it. And so as we walk through this, we should see that the situation, the circumstance should have prevented Moses from ever even existing. But God, by his grace, made provisions and made a way for Moses to live. And so as we see Moses' life unfold, we look at these provisions that God gave him, and look at all the things that God did. First, he protected him and allowed him to be born in the first place. Second, he allowed for Moses' mother to hide him and protect him for 3 months. And then not only was she able to hide him, when she wasn't able to hide him, and she decided to make that decision to put him in the river, she trusted God, and God provided that the alligators and the dangerous waters and all the things that are going on in the Nile River didn't do anything to disrupt this baby in a basket. And not only did he survive this river journey, he gets found by none other than Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter opens the basket, realizing that it's a Hebrew boy, understanding that there's been a decree in place that they are supposed to kill Hebrew boys. Rather than kill the boy on the site, she has pity for him. God's doing some amazing things in Moses' young life. But it didn't stop there, because when Pharaoh's daughter took pity on him, she needed somebody to take care of him. And so his sister shows up and provides someone to take care of him, none other than his mother. So the mother that trusted God to give the child away is now receiving the child back, because God had a plan and a purpose. And what's more, this is something only God can do. Not only did she get the child back, but she got paid to be a mom. How many moms deserve to be paid from being a mom? I was blessed to grow up with my mom at home, and we used to say that my mom didn't work until we got old enough to realize that was not the case. Because my mother worked just about as hard as anybody else I knew, and she just stayed home so that she could care for us. So Pharaoh's mother is gets this child back that she just gave up. And not only does she get him back, does she get to raise him and nurse him to an age that he should be given back to Pharaoh's daughter, but she gets paid for it. Now, God's doing some amazing things. And in the bleakest of situations, in the most unnerving of situations for young Moses and this baby to be placed into a river, you may be thinking that this is it for Moses. Before he even, does the things he's going to do, he's not going to make it past the river. But God, by his grace, made a way and made a plan. He extended grace so that only God could receive the glory, because no one could orchestrate all of those things except for God. And that's just the reality of the situation that Moses found himself in, and it's incredible. But God is just getting started. God is just getting started. Because as Moses grew older, and we'll pick up in verse 11, as he grew older, some more situations arise, and they had to walk through those. Look in verse 11 of chapter 2. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So as Moses continues to grow and he gets older, he's been introduced to the Egyptian culture because Moses, as we said, he deserved to be killed, an unjust death by that, a decree to kill him. He deserved to be killed, but what he received was life in Pharaoh's court. He grew up as an Egyptian. He grew up knowing the customs and the culture and the language, and he was educated by the Egyptians, and he knew all the things that there was to know about the Egyptians, and yet he was born a Hebrew. So now as we grow up and as he gets older, he finds himself in an interesting predicament. Because he was born a Hebrew, yet he lived as an Egyptian. So when he looks on and sees the oppression that's going on, and he sees the oppressive behavior that the Egyptians are bestowing upon the Israelites, he has a heart conflict. Is it my people or is it my people? Which one? And as we see in the story, his heart leans towards his birth people, and so he strikes down this Egyptian, and he finds himself in another interesting situation. So he was first born when he shouldn't have been born, and now he finds himself committing a crime, committing an act that deserved punishment. Because when you commit a crime, there's always something that goes along with it. Except when God's in the picture and he extends mercy and grace. I haven't told this story very often because a lot of people don't believe it. But one time, I was driving to Oklahoma with my family. We were going to a wedding shower that we were having some of Allie's friends in Oklahoma. And we're driving along, and we're passing through Bryan College Station, and we're going up over a hill. And you know how it goes. You get up over the hill, and there's the police officer. And as soon as I passed the car, the lights flicked on, and I knew it. The crime I'd committed was going to be found out, and I was going to have to pay for my speeding ticket. So I pull over, and I, as always, was extremely respectful to this officer and tried to show every courtesy and respectful thing I could possibly say. I think I said thank you for a ticket about 12 times before they left. The officer asked me, "What is it that you do for a living?" And I said, "Well, I'm a pastor." And Allie always rolls her eyes when I say that because she thinks that's like, I'm a pastor, let me off, right? It doesn't always work that way. And so the crime I committed deserved a ticket, and so she gives me the ticket, and we continue on our way. A few miles down the road, about 10 or 15 minutes, I get a call on my cell phone from a Bryan number. I'm like, that's interesting. And so I answer the call, and it was the police officer. And she said, Mr. Fleming? And I said, yes. And she said, this is Officer such and such. I just gave you a ticket. And I said, uh-huh. Well, what can I do for you? And she said, well, I was thinking, and I pulled over a pastor last week, and he was relatively disrespectful. And it really just touched me in my heart that you are preaching you're practicing what you're preaching, and you were just so respectful and kind, and you haven't had a ticket in a few years, and so I'm just going to change this to a warning. Is that okay with you? I said, yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And she said, okay, well, is this a good number I can text you on? I'll just take a picture of it, and I'll send it to you, and you're good to go. And I said, yeah, this is a great number to text me on. So she texted me the picture of the ticket, and it was crossed out ticket and written warning, and that story is one of a kind. I've never heard anybody be able to top it. So if you think you can, we'll test that out later. But the story is a good story, but the lesson is I deserved to pay a fine. But what I received was grace. And the same is true for Moses here. Moses deserves to pay a price. He killed someone. People saw it. People found out about it. Pharaoh found out about it. They didn't care that he was born a Hebrew and raised an Egyptian and he's got all these heart problems going on. They didn't care about any of that because the crime was committed and the fine needed to be paid. And instead of paying his fine, instead of doing that, he decides that it's time to probably get out of here. And rather than, God putting him back in front of Pharaoh and saying, you know what, Moses, you did it, you pay it. God offered him mercy when he didn't deserve it. And he gave him protection as he made his way out of the city. In the form of an escape to the desert, God gave him grace. And Moses didn't have to pay for his crime. He didn't have to spend eternity in jail or even worse, be killed. He went to seminary of the desert. Have you ever heard of seminary of the desert? That's where Moses found himself in the waning 40 or so years in the wilderness where he was getting really good at walking around the wilderness. That would come in handy later on. But Moses finds himself in the desert, and he begins to learn how to navigate the desert. He begins to learn how to walk over hills and know the landscape and know where there might be water and how to tend to the sheep, because at this point he's a shepherd. And so he's learning how to tend to sheep and lead the sheep. And God all the while is working on him, molding him, shaping him into the man that he's supposed to be. And so while Moses deserved to die for his crimes, to pay for his crimes, that's not what he received. Because God was involved. And God had a plan and a purpose for Moses' life, and it wasn't to die at the hands of Pharaoh. He hadn't received his calling yet, his mission yet, but God mercifully dealt with Moses and his sin. And instead of the just punishment that he deserved, God extended grace. And so God showed grace in his sin. God showed grace in his sin. So that only God could receive the glory for the outcome. Because if it wasn't for God, Moses would be dead in Egypt. But God was involved, and God gets the glory. But God wasn't done preparing Moses. If you would, jump down a few verses to Exodus chapter 3, verse 9. Exodus chapter 3, verse 9. So as Moses is shepherding in the wilderness, as he's getting really good at walking around the wilderness and learning how to not be thirsty all the time, this scene unfolds. A burning bush appears before Moses. And Moses sees this burning bush and begins to question, what is going on? And so Moses kind of gets over to it, and God tells him, take your sandals off because this is holy ground. And Moses walks over to this burning bush, and the Lord is talking to Moses out of this bush. And imagine with me just for a moment what Moses' face must have looked like. If it was today, he would be looking for the cameras because this has to be a prank. I mean, first, there's a bush, it's burning, but it's not being burned. Second, there's a voice coming out of the bush, and the voice claims to be God. I'm sure this is not a regular occurrence in Moses' life. He's got to be looking around wondering what on earth is going on. But then the real kicker comes when God's message for Moses is totally outside of Moses' realm of reality. Let's look at it in verse 9. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses is like, no, thank you. You do remember, God, that Pharaoh that you want me to go talk to wants me dead. You do remember what you saved me from. You do remember what you provided and protected me to get away from, don't you? And now you're asking me to go back to that same guy to tell him that you're going to take all the slaves out of Egypt? God, I don't have any clue if I'm hearing you correctly. But that's what God told him to do, to go back to Egypt, to talk to Pharaoh, to get the Israelites to be released from Egypt. And Moses would be the one to lead them out. Moses has to think this is all too much. Moses has to think this is all too much, but it wasn't too much. And God is continuously working and has a plan through this situation. So we saw that God showed Moses grace in his birth and in his upbringing, and then we saw that he showed him grace in his sin, but he also showed him grace in his shortcomings. And there were many shortcomings. The first shortcoming comes in chapter 3, verse 11. After God gives him this mission, this plan, this idea that we're going to go back to Egypt and we're going to lead the people out as if there's not going to be any opposition, and the same man that wants to kill Moses is going to just say, yes, sir, where do I sign? Moses is a little bit taken aback by this, and not just because it's a crazy situation with the burning bush and God and all this, but this is a tall task for anybody, let alone Moses. You remember Moses, the zero, before he encountered God's grace? Although Moses had made some improvements, although he had made some strides towards the man God wanted him to be, when God presented him with something in front of him, Moses reverted back to that zero form. And he found himself back in the situation where, I can't do this, God. I know you've done a lot through me and for me, but I just can't. And so Moses begins to lay out his shortcomings. And I'm going to read verse 11 of chapter 3. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children out of Egypt? Now bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. God said, but I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. And then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. Jump ahead to chapter 4, verse 1. Chapter 4, verse 1. Moses is continuing to lay out his shortcomings and tell God why he can't do what God just told him to do. Verse 1, then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. And the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. I run from snakes too. Do you run from snakes? I hate snakes. Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it. And it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. Jump down to verse 10. But Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow to speech and of tongue." And then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now, therefore, go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." So Moses lays out some shortcomings that he feels that he has that would prevent him from going to Egypt, to Pharaoh, to tell Pharaoh what God has told him that he should be doing with the Israelites that are being oppressed and are being used as slaves. Like any of us, I think we would start to find some excuses of why we're not qualified or why we're not good enough or why we shouldn't be going. And so let's walk back through that text and we'll be able to see these 4 or 5 shortcomings that Moses tries to lay out and how each time God extends grace and shows grace and overcomes each one of them. Number 1, the first one is, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Moses is kind of trying to give God maybe a reality check of, do you remember who I am? Do you remember what I've been, what I've done? Do you remember the things that I've come out of, and you want me to go to Pharaoh? God, I'm just a lowly shepherd. I enjoy walking with my sheep, and you want me to go to Pharaoh? Who am I? And while Moses may have a point, and he does have some sort of an argument that, yeah, he's kind of a nobody. God responds to him and gives him some grace and shows him that in his shortcoming, he promises that he'll be with him. Verse 12, "But I will be with you." That's all we need. But I will be with you. But God, I'm a nobody, but I will be with you. When we begin to find ourselves being asked by God to do things and we begin to try to find excuses of why we shouldn't go or why we shouldn't do that, that's the best promise that we can ask for is, I will be with you. God, I can't go across the street to my neighbor's house. They may laugh at me, but I will be with you. God, I can't go around the world to share the gospel with the unreached people groups, but I will be with you. No matter where we find ourselves in life, no matter what we find ourselves doing in life, when we start to have doubts about whether we're worthy or whether we're anybody that should be going to do that, remember this promise, I will be with you. Because God is with us at every turn. And his grace is sufficient for us, and it is working ahead of us. It is providing a way for us to be used by him for his glory. So Moses' first shortcoming of I'm a nobody wasn't good enough for God. Wasn't a good enough reason to not go back to Egypt. Because I will be with you is all Moses needed. The presence of God was enough. Shortcoming number 2, Moses was worried about, I don't have all the answers. What if they ask me, who sent you? What if they ask me, who are you talking to? Who's giving you this information? Am I supposed to tell them a bush? Surely I'm not supposed to tell them a bush, God. That's not what you're asking me to do, to go make a fool of myself. I won't be able to give them the adequate answers that they need to trust me that we'll be able to get out of here. And God responds in grace once again and shows him that all you need to know and all you need to tell them is that I am sent you. And not only that I am sent you, but I am sent you, and I am will give you the answers that you need. I will guide you, I will protect you, I will provide for you. By my grace, it's sufficient for your no answers, Moses. So when we try to find ourselves sitting in a situation where we can't share our faith, because what if they ask me a really hard question? We learned a long time ago when I was in school that sometimes it's okay to not know all the answers. And I got to admit, I was one of those that struggled with that from an early age. Because at every turn, at every question, I figured if I could at least make up a believable answer, it'll work. So I used to just kind of make stuff up because it sounded right, and people were like, you're 4, but that sounds right. It didn't last very long. Eventually, people caught on that I was just making stuff up, but sometimes it's just about the courage to be there. Sometimes it's okay to say, I don't know, but I can find out. I don't know what God thinks about this, but I can find out. When you're in a situation where you're sharing your faith and you're doing things that make you nervous or uncomfortable and you just don't want to do it because you're scared that maybe sometimes we're not going to have the answers, just trust that God is with you, because I am sent you, and I am will give you the answers that you need. So Moses' second shortcoming, that he wouldn't have all the answers, was dismissed by God and extended grace from God, that he would give him the answers that he needs. And now the shortcoming number 3 there in chapter 4, maybe they won't believe me or listen to me. Now, I've been out here in the desert, and you know what they say about people who hang out in the desert for too long? They come back delirious and all kinds of crazy things happening. And oh, by the way, I'm going to have to tell them that you told me this through a bush. Once again, God, they're not going to believe this. They're not going to believe that we're supposed to be leaving. They're not supposed to believe that I'm the one that's supposed to do that. That's a very real concern for Moses, and maybe for us too as we walk through our lives. And maybe if you have to walk into a situation where you're not sure if they'll believe your witness or what you're going to tell them about Jesus, that would be a good reason maybe to hold back. Maybe I'll go when I know that I can share it in a way that they will for sure believe it. But until we start sharing, until we start getting out of our comfort zone, whether or not they'll believe it or not, we need to leave that up to God. We need to play our part. We need to do our piece in the puzzle and leave the rest up to God. And that's what God tells Moses here by extending some grace to him. Once again, God shows that his grace in his shortcoming by giving Moses a way to tell them, a way to show them. He gives them some proof. He says, here, take this staff, make it a snake, and then touch it, and it'll go back to a staff. And then I want you to use that staff when you have someone that won't believe you. The same way that I just used it. Make it a snake, and then make it a staff. They'll believe you. So Moses is concerned they won't believe him, but God didn't dismiss Moses' his fear or his doubt as enough of a reason not to go back to Egypt. He gave him grace, and he extended grace, and he provided a way for him to overcome that shortcoming. Shortcoming number 4 in verse 10 of chapter 4, Moses is running out of excuses, but his fourth excuse maybe is the one that would be your best sales pitch if you're trying to sell something. And Moses tells him, God, I have a speech impediment. I can't go. They're not going to listen to me. They're going to laugh at me. I'm not eloquent in my speech. I don't know how to talk in front of people. I can't go stand in front of Pharaoh, who's a very educated man, and talk in a way that wouldn't seem like I'm educated, because that's just not the case, Lord. What am I supposed to do about my speech impediment? And God says, don't worry about that. Am I not the one who created your mouth? Am I not the one who gave you the words to speak, or the one who gave you the eyes to see, the ears to hear? Am I not the God who created all of this, everything around you? Do you not think that I can put the words in your mouth and have them come out in a way that would convey the truth? So Moses is really trying to do everything that he can to get God to say, you know what, you're right, I'll go find someone else. But that's not what God does. Because when God chooses to use someone, there's a reason behind it, and it's for his glory. It's for his glory. And finally, the last shortcoming, the final last-ditch effort that Moses gives is essentially, Lord, I'm just not qualified to do this. You've seen my history. You've seen my track record. You've watched me. You've been with me. You've given me more grace than any one person should be able to experience. And yet, now you're asking me to go do something that I am wholly unqualified to do. To stand before Pharaoh and ask him to release your people. You see, God qualified Moses for this mission long ago. The first time he extended grace to Moses, Moses was qualified. Because we've said it around here many of times, Moses may have deserved to be overlooked because he was unqualified, but God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And Moses found himself in a situation where he deserved to be overlooked and left unused. But what Moses received was a qualification through God's grace for God's glory. It's the only qualification any of us need. We find ourselves maybe trying to be the most qualified or understanding the most or learning the most or being the most experienced so that we'll be qualified to do something. But the reality is, none of us are qualified to do anything unless there's God's grace in the picture. So Moses found himself in this situation where he's feeling unqualified, he's feeling unworthy, but God says, stop thinking about that because there's grace involved here. You're trying to do a math equation without the grace, and the grace is what is the equation's answer. It doesn't work without grace. And so Moses experiences this grace, and God gives him this grace, and through Moses' life, there's more than enough reason for him to be left out, but that's not the way God had it drawn up. Because God's plan was to extend grace. God's plan was that when Moses was facing death on multiple occasions, God's plan was to provide a way. When Moses found himself feeling underqualified, feeling unworthy, God's plan was to extend grace to make him qualified. Because God has a plan and a purpose. And God, by grace, did something amazing through Moses. And he walked him through this journey, and he sent him back to Pharaoh, and he walked those Israelites out. And then later on, he would deliver God's law. And yet, it was only because of grace. It was only because of grace. And there is really, really, really good news for us tonight. And that good news is the same grace that Moses received to make him qualified, the same grace that Moses received to save his life on multiple occasions, the same grace that enabled Moses to follow through on the mission and the call that God had placed him on is available for me and for you. You see, God made this grace available to all of us. Many of us have come to a point in our life, maybe some point during Moses' life, where we've looked at our life and we've just thought we were just born into the wrong situation. I wasn't born into wealth. I wasn't born into opportunity. I was born on the wrong side of the tracks. I was born to a single parent or two parents that didn't love each other, or two parents that did love each other but didn't love me. Whatever the situation may be, we found ourselves in a situation where we need God's grace to help us get from that point to where he needs us to go. And it's only through his grace that we can get there. Some of us also find ourselves in a situation like Moses when he left Egypt. We've done something, we've been involved in something that is just too hard for us to overlook. And surely if we can't overlook it, God can't overlook it. So we find ourselves on the outskirts, in the wilderness, trying to do our own thing because we've messed up. We've done something that is just unforgivable. But in the same way that Moses did something that seemed unforgivable, in the same way that Moses had done something that God had to intervene and protect him from and extend grace to him to forgive him and to grow him. That same grace is available for us. And finally, maybe some of us, we just feel unworthy. We just feel unqualified. We don't feel like God can do anything with us because why would he? There's many people, there's a lot of other people that are worthy, that could do a lot better job. They're a lot better speakers. They're much better at sharing their faith. They're much better at discipling. God will surely use them because he has no use for me. But God, by his grace, has extended a way to qualify you, to make you worthy, to bring you up from the depths of your despair into his glory. A few years back, many of you have heard my story. I was making some decisions and doing some things that probably shouldn't have been doing. Found myself in a situation where I was within a couple inches of my life. I haven't told the story in a long time. Sorry. You find yourself in a situation where you're starting to wonder, God, what do you want? What are you doing? I felt unworthy. I felt unqualified. But God, by his grace, extended it to me, the one who was unworthy. And this road of recovery, I guess you could say, of walking back towards the Lord and getting back in relationship, and I still feel that way today. God, I am so unworthy to be in his presence, and especially unworthy to stand on this stage and open this Bible before you. But God, by his grace, has extended it to me, and he'll extend it to you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. We pray that the truth of God's Word is both encouraging and uplifting to you. If you'd like more information about our church, service times, or locations, or if you have a question about what you heard today and you want to connect with someone, I want to encourage you to visit us on our website at championforest.org. Have a great day, and God bless.